So politics and piety. And the Imam Rahimahullah Ta'ala Ibn Qudama, of course, taking from the original works of Ibn al-Jawzi and Imam al-Ghazali. They talk about conditions or circumstances in which you would come in contact with politicians, officials, and authorities. And there's obviously some context to them in their time period and what they're referring to. And so we have to take that context into consideration. So first and foremost, they're talking about Muslim government. And they're going to be talking about cases where you come in contact with these officials or these politicians or leaders, if you will, that are oppressive, that are sinful. And what they do is oppression and sin. What we're looking at is a different situation where our politicians and officials and authorities are not Muslim. They're not oppressors, they're kafara. They're like not upholding any sort of divine tradition or divine law. And of course, that's just the society that we live in. And we live here by choice. And so we have to interact in a way that's befitting as a Muslim and as a citizen. So we'll look at what the Imam points out, and then we'll try and draw a conclusion at the end as to a few points that I want to bring out. Of course, there's a lot that can be said about this. However, I think there's a few points of piety that we need to walk away with. So he begins here and he says, there's good news and there's bad news, right? So he's going to begin with the bad news. He says there are three different scenarios when it comes to interacting with politicians, officials, and authorities. He says the first of those is that you interact with them, that you go to their places of politics. He says this is the worst case scenario, that you become involved with them directly. So we're talking about oppressive leadership and sinful authority in the Muslim world, not the disbelieving peoples. And so Muslim authorities that are oppressive are still Muslim in nature and still have some divine law during this time of the authorship that they were upholding, whether they were sinful in other areas or not. So basically he quotes from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, "Man ata abawab as-salatin." Basically, whoever goes to the doors of the governors or the rulers will be tried. They will be tested. They will find their fitna. So fitna can be a trial or a tribulation, but it's also a temptation. It's an allurement, if you will. He says also, "Mazdada abdun min as-sultan qurban illa zdada min Allahi bu'da." That the closer you draw near to the authorities or these officials, the further away you will be from Allah due to this temptation. It was mentioned by Hudayfa. He says, beware of situations of trial and temptation. It was said, what are these situations? He said, they are the doors to the officials and the politicians and the authorities. You go in there and you're standing in front of that authority and you may approve his lies. Or you may falsely praise, because that's power in front of you. And so it takes a really, really strong person who is fearless of reprisal to stand up to that in that moment of weakness. You have the authority standing there and they're like, isn't that true? It may be it's just wrong as wrong can be, and he says come in, even if it's by direct speech or by a wave of the hand or a facial expression that you just kind of like, I can't say anything, and so I have to just say yeah, you're right, and you have to basically approve of falsehood, etc. It was mentioned that some of the leaders the governors or the officials, they said to some of the pious, zuhad, these are like those that abstain from the world, they considered the saintly types. He said, why don't you come visit us? Why don't you come to us? And one of them, of the saints, they said, or the ascetics, they said, I'm afraid that if I come close to you, or that if you bring me close to you, I will be tempted and tried. But if you keep me at arm's distance and far, I will be deprived. Right? So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. He says, you don't have what I want, and I don't have what would cause me to fear you. Like Zahid, he's not after political power and position. He's not after, these types of the splendor that comes with that. The Zahid is after the hereafter. He's abstained from the world, so he doesn't have any interest in that. And then the Zahid also doesn't have what would cause him to fear the ruler. He doesn't have power, and he doesn't have authority. He's not trying to get it. He has what tools that he needs for the hereafter. And the sultan, the governor, that's not their territory, typically, especially the oppressive type. He says to the governor, those that come to you seek what will suffice them from others. Basically, it's you or the other guy. They're coming to you. If they get what they need, they won't go to the other guy. He says, and I do without you, because I have the one who has availed me from you. Meaning, I don't need you because I have Allah. And Allah has sufficed me. I don't need your position or your power. I'm happy without it. And so here are a couple of examples of obviously hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and also some of the traditions that have been passed down that highlight the disliked nature of mixing with these officials and authorities. He also says that a person that goes in there opens themselves up to transgression, basically sin. They open themselves up to committing a sin against Allah. And there's three ways this is done. Either it's done by action, by statement, or by silence. The first of action, he says that a person can go in there and most of the time you're going into places that have been usurped. You're going into places that have been taken by force from the government, by the authorities. And we're talking about that context. And it may be prevalent in some areas of the world where they've come in and they said, yep, we're taking this land, or we're taking this property, we're taking this building and confiscating it for government purposes, and there's no payment. It's just a power play there. So that's haram. And we talked about that in the previous section when it comes to the levels of things which are impermissible. He says, and if we were to say that it wasn't usurped, then you'll find, in most cases, that which is either under you or that which is above you, which is from impermissible money. And what he's talking about is when you walk in, the carpeting, the flooring, the walls, the ceiling, the tent perhaps that's sheltering you and shading you from the sun, this more than likely is from impermissible sources of revenue. And so you're benefiting from that while you're there, while you're visiting or you're working or you're mingling with, and all of that's impermissible. And he says, and if we were to concede that all of that was halal, then it's possible that you fall into other loathsome things. For example, the way that you greet them. And during that time, some cultures, he said, perhaps you prostrate to them. Perhaps you bow, he doesn't say, this is my addition, you bow to them. Or perhaps it's a handshake of the opposite gender. Right? The politician's there, Mrs. So-and-so of the office of such and such, and you feel, it's just such a mawqif, a fitna. Right? This situation is so trying and tempting that you greet them in a way which is mahdhur. It's impermissible. Whether that's big or small, it is what it is. Or you greet them in such a way that honors them, dignifies them, you serve them in some way, or you show humility towards them due to their position of authority, and that authority is what they are using to oppress others or to commit wrong. So he says, showing humility towards an oppressor is sinful. He says, showing authority to a person of means, that is, well off and rich, because they are well off and rich, and not for any other meaning which would require you to show their humility, then by doing so, you've lost a third of your religion. So what about a person that is humble with an oppressor? He says, for example, kissing their hand is sinful, unless you're in a moment of fear. If you don't do it, then there could be some type of repercussion. He says also for example, the just imam, the just leader, or the scholar that deserves that, other than what's been mentioned, then it's not permissible when it comes to these types because of who they are. All they get from you is the salam. They don't get anything else besides that. Right? They're not deserving of your humility. They're not deserving of your service. They're not deserving of your respect. They're certainly not deserving of your warm welcomes. So that's the first one when it comes to what you could do wrong in terms of your actions. The next thing is what you could say that would be blameworthy. Number one, he says, is that you make dua for the zalim. Make dua for him. Not for his rectification or his guidance, but you make dua, for example, for a long-term, prosperous life, etc. Or you praise him. Or you approve something that was said falsely, either directly, and this was hinted at earlier, or by nodding the head, or through facial expression, those types of things. Or you make your love for them obvious. You have an affinity to them, and then you have a desire to be in their company and to meet them. You seek that they have a long term. You want to see to their long term in office, in power. So more than likely, what's permitted, like he says, is to give them the salam. But if you're around them enough and you're mixing with this type enough, you're not going to simply be saying salam, but you're going to be conversing. You're going to be talking. And more than likely, you're going to fall into one of these different types of, troubling things. It was reported by a tradition or a narration that whoever supplicates for the oppressor to have a long term in office, it's a sign that, or it shows that they love that Allah, that there is sin against Allah. If a person is supplicating that the authority is in power for a long time, and they're oppressive, they're an oppressive ruler. Oh Allah, extend his term. Oh Allah, give him a second term or a third term or whatever. Then it means that you like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says rights are trampled upon, meaning sin is committed. And so it is not permissible to do that. It's not permissible to supplicate for them in such a way, unless you're going to say, rectify them, give them success, meaning success to what Allah loves and is pleased with, etc. You're going to rectify, you're going to make supplication that Allah straightens them, as opposed to blessing them to continue in such a terrible manner. The last category, number 3, and that is being silent. So what he's talking about now is being silent when it comes to witnessing sin in front of you. So he says here that when you're in their gatherings, when you're in their, their offices, etc., and you see, silken adornments, you see silver goblets and gold and those types of things which we know are impermissible, or they're wearing impermissible clothing, or their servants are wearing impermissible clothing, etc., and you just sit there silently. And you just watch it, and it's almost like a tacit approval in a way, because every time you're silent in front of sin, you become a partner in it. It's like a tacit approval, just watching it happen, and you don't say anything. If you hear something that they say that is illicit, it's lewd, it's a lie, it's a curse, it's harmful, and you sit there quietly, all of this is impermissible, because we've been commanded by Allah to order the good and forbid the evil. So when we see sin, as the Prophet ﷺ said himself, that when you see an evil, you have to change it. Either you take physical action, or you speak out against it, or at the very least you hate it in your heart. And that, of course, is the weakest of faith. So a person may say, well, they're there, and if they say anything, they're worried that there may be some consequence. And that's why they're being quiet. And so they're excused for their silence. They're sitting among the officials, sitting among the authorities that are oppressive, that are sinful, etc. And they're watching all of the sin, hearing the negativity, and they're just silently sitting there. He says, well, he's there and he's worried, or she's worried, and so they should be excused for their silence. He responds and says, that's true, but the person is in no need of exposing themselves to such sin. If they're just there and there's no need, there's no dire need for them to be there, then they don't need to expose themselves to the sin. And therefore, especially when there's no need, and therefore, we can't use that excuse. We can't play around with these types of excuses and not keep it real. So he says if he doesn't go in, then he won't see those things, and then he won't be obliged to command and order, the good and forbid the evil. And this is a good general principle. If a person knows they're going to a place that is evil, or it's a place filled with corruption, and they know that if they attend, they cannot remove that sin or that corruption, it's not permissible for them to go there. And you can apply this with just about anything. If you know you've been invited to a place, or you're going to go visit a place, and there's sin and evil that's surrounding that place, and it's just what it's all about, you're going to go there, and you can't stop it, you can't do anything to change it, then you shouldn't be going there in the first place. Now, if you can go there and stop it, you have the authority to do that, then by all means, Bismillah. Go there and bring things back to the center line of righteousness. And this includes personal invitations that we get sometimes. I know in Islam it's a huge thing to accept invitations, and it's part of our tradition that when someone invites us that we go. But if we know that we're going to go, and it's going to be an invitation to sin, or an environment that's sinful, and we go there, we have no word, we have no pedestal, we have no position to say, hey, look, this is wrong, we should stop, and we should do something better, then it's impermissible to go. So that's number one. The next section he talks about is mixing with such types, these authorities and politicians that are oppressive and sinful, when you have an excuse to do so. He says, if we are free from everything previously mentioned, which is almost an impossibility, then we won't be free from corruption that could penetrate into our own hearts. And this is because typically when you visit, you'll see the grand life that they live or appear to be living. And so, in turn, you become dissatisfied with the blessings that Allah has bestowed upon you. You see them in this position of authority, you see them in this power, with all this power, you see them with wealth, you see them with, everything that comes with that. And then you begin to look at yourself and you go, oh man, I'm nobody. I don't have anything. And so what happens is you diminish Allah's favor. You diminish Allah's favor. And so that is something that has to be taken into consideration. And then perhaps by you going, someone follows in your footsteps, takes your example and goes as well. And then you have all of these people behind and around the oppressors. It's mentioned by Sa'id ibn Musayyib. He was called to give allegiance to al-Walid and Sulaiman. These were the sons of Abdul Malik al-Mirwan, who was the Khalifa. And then his sons wanted to take the pledge, or receive the pledge, in order to be recognized as the leader. So both of them at the same time, which is an impossibility. And he says, I'm not going to give any to my allegiance at the same time. So long as there's still a night and a day, I will not do it. And they said, look, you can go in this door and go out the other door. Basically, you come in, pledge your allegiance, and you go out the back door. No one will see you. And he refused to do that. He refused to do that. And he swore upon Allah, he said, I will not have anyone follow my example. Not one single person. They see me come in or not leave or whatever, I won't do it. And so he was whipped for that 100 times. And he was made to wear a sackcloth, which is a way they used to punish people. It's like that burlap sack that all of the uncomfortable material goes inwards, and you put that on and it's real. Yeah, so he had to deal with the with the consequences. But he was righteous enough that he was ready to do that. And there were only, a rare few throughout the history of Islam in comparison to the size of the ummah. I mean, we have some real heroes in our history. But I mean, they're notable because of what they did, and this is an example of that. So he says, according to what has been mentioned, it's just not permissible to go into these places and be among these types of officials and politicians of oppression and sin, except that you have one of two excuses. The first excuse is that you're required to go. You're required to be there, and you're afraid that if you don't go, there'll be some type of repercussion, some type of harm. That's number one. The second is that you go there in order to help a Muslim that's been wronged. You go there to help someone out. And it's permitted for you to go so long as you do not lie, you do not flatter them, you do not abandon any advice that you believe may be accepted, and according to your ability to do that is the ruling of your attendance. If you can't, you can't go. If you can go, etc. The next condition here is when an official visits you. So now you're not on their home turf, but they're coming to your home turf. They're coming to pay you a visit. And so, obviously, responding to the salam, the greeting, is something that has to be done. Raddu salam, wajib, as the Prophet ﷺ said, returning a salam is an obligation. Giving the salam first is not an obligation. Extending it first is a fadila, right? It's a virtuous thing. But responding to it is a religious obligation. And there's some exceptions to that. However, in general, it's a religious obligation. So he says here, for example, standing up for them, being generous with them, it's not impermissible to do so in exchange for their generosity or for their honor. You know, if they come and visit you and they show honor and they're dignified in the way they treat you, etc., then you can respond in the same way. You know, it's kind of, just giving them what they gave you. Because a person of knowledge and of religiosity is deserving of such praise. Just like a person of oppression is deserving of disparagement. So he says here, if they come and visit you and you're alone, and you see that standing up for them and honoring them would bring about strength and might to the faith, like it would show well to Islam, then you should do that. And then if they come and visit you in a crowd of people, then you should take into consideration decorum. You should take into consideration what the optics of it will be with the people that are in attendance. That if you don't, or you act in a certain manner, that is given preference over trying to show some type of disapproval to the authority. It may be, we need to consider everybody else first and consider them last. So in this case, if that's the intention, there's no problem standing up and honoring them. He says here that if you know that doing that will not bring about, meaning not standing and not greeting in such an honorable way, will not bring about any harm to the community, and they will not receive their wrath, then not greeting them in such a dignified, very, very celebratory manner is preferred. And typically it was like, everyone stands up and you go through the whole rigmarole of that greeting, and it's made into this big deal, throwing out the red carpet, etc., etc., much like what we have all this pomp and circumstance when politicians visit different places. They have this parade, they have this big celebration for their arrival, and it's all about celebrating their presence and appreciating their role. And so in the event that they are oppressive or they are sinful or they are evil, then it's preferred that they are not greeted in such a way. So they get the point. Look, it's like kind of like now where they're met with protesters. They're met with, words of disapproval, etc. And so this is one of the ways in which a person can show their disapproval. But he says you have to consider the outcome. As long as it won't bring about any corruption or harm for the general population, or they won't be on the receiving end of the authorities' wrath, then this is how you can greet them. That's the second condition. The third one, so remember I said there were three things. There's going in and mingling and being a part of this whole deal. The second is going there with an excuse, and we've talked about the two excuses that you have in order to do it. The third one, and this is best for last, is to refrain totally, is to stay away completely so that you don't see them and they don't see you. And by doing that, you're safe. You're safe from everything that could result in being in their company. All of the previous detriments, whether it's sin, whether it's being the subject of oppression or corruption, etc. He says, and doing that, you also should believe, what they're doing is oppressive, and you should be angry about that. You should be upset. It's kind of like, the last stage when you have this disdain in your heart. And so you don't want to meet them. You don't want to greet them. You certainly don't want to flatter them or praise them. You're not interested in how they're doing or what's going on. And you're not seeking to get around people that are close to them, their assistants and their aides, etc. And you're not sad when they miss out on things. You're not sad when their term comes to an end or something's afflicted them. They're having a bad time in the press. You're like, that's what you get, man. What goes around comes around. Jazat min jins al-amal. The reward is the result of the action. So if you're bad, you get bad. You're oppressive, you're going to be oppressed. And so when that happens, it's not like, hey, I'm not saddened by that in the slightest. And so that's essentially what the Imam mentions when it comes to dealing with politicians, officials, authorities of a corrupt nature, of a sinful nature.